Releasing in 1984, 2 years after the original theatrical cut of Blade Runner, Neuromancer created a world of rain-slick streets and hazy neon lights, where the morality, dreams, and fears of its inhabitants are submerged in the shadow of a future that waits for no one. A place where hope is often inert and waiting under a poisoned silver sky. In doing so, Neuromancer and Blade Runner solidified what we know to be cyberpunk today. The visual aesthetic of Blade Runner, and the perception of future technology in Neuromancer, is reflected in more or less every work of cyberpunk. I want to take a step back from this though, and ask a question. What makes something cyberpunk? Is it what it looks like? Sounds like? Plays like? Dig a little deeper at the ideas that these monumental works put before us, and we might be able to get at the roots of why they were put there in the first place. Starting with what I think is the biggest misconception regarding cyberpunk, which is Blade Runner is an exploration of the nature of identity and humanity in a world where concepts like that are rendered dubious by the advances in technology. Something cyberpunk borrows an inspiration from earlier works of noir fiction is a world of ambiguous morality. I don't think this necessarily needs to equate to dystopia. As you can see in Ghost in the Shell, and as so wonderfully explained by the Nerdwriter, there exists a space for heterotopias in cyberpunk. It's not so much about having a world that oppresses its inhabitants, as opposed to having a world that is nuanced in how it questions the morality of progress. A world that begs the question of what living in it would feel like. Here's a little world-building detail you see in both the old and new Blade Runner. In the original, the living quarters of Eldon Tyrell are predominantly fashioned in the style of the old world, affecting the appearance of wood, or perhaps even being real wood. And you see the same thing repeated in Blade Runner 2049, only this time it's used in the Wallace Corporation. In both places, the wood is a signifier, a symbol to indicate the wealth and largesse of its owner, its rarity made meaningful by the lack of seeing any real living trees in the world.
It's artificial?
Of course it is.
Just like the question Deckard asks Rachel about the owl, this too is another question, waiting to be asked, hiding in the background.
I'm Rachel.
Deckard.
Technology is a tool, like any other. In and of itself, it's probably not very interesting. It's when technology intersects with the needs of humanity that you have a story worth telling. How this intersection pans out is up to you, but the point of cyberpunk is most assuredly not the cool gadgets, but how the cool gadgets affect people's lives. This is why I think the stories of the new Deus Ex games don't land very well, because much of the story centers the conflict on the presence of the augmentations, but the augmentations are just pointless bits of metal and silicon if you don't care about the people that they are attached to. Adam Jensen isn't an unlikable protagonist, he's just not a protagonist whose life feels in any way believably impacted by having his augmentations, and complaining about how he didn't ask to be Robocop does not count. It's hard to empathize with a character that so rarely shows vulnerability. The game does depict some augmented characters in a sympathetic light in the side quests to its credit, so it can't be said that there's no good storytelling in Mankind Divided, it's just hard to find. In issue 3 of Transmetropolitan, an acclaimed series of graphic novels written by Warren Ellis and illustrated by Derek Robinson, Warren Ellis has this to say in the letter call, regarding the trends and tropes in prominent science fiction of the time. I've been largely disappointed. Something isn't taking. For every Adoru, and thank Christ William Gibson saw past his Neuromancer sequence and realized that it was the ongoing cultural mix that was important, and not the boys' toys. I don't mean to pick on the new Deus Ex games, but they're such a perfect encapsulation of what I think is an issue with a lot of science fiction, where the creators wield the changes in technology like a hammer and use it to bludgeon the point into the audience's brain. This approach lacks subtlety. Every part of the world screams at you that the source of all the conflict is the augmentations. People toss slurs like clank and Hanser at you as they walk by. Police hold you up and ask for documents. The augmented population are made to live within segregated tenements and have their rights slowly legislated away from them. The world threatens to boil over into violence as fear of augmentations make tensions rise, in no small part due to the actions of shadowy conspiracies that seemingly control everything behind the curtain. Another problem is the game is often content to reiterate the same point over and over. People don't like augmentations, or the people who have them, and think that they are dangerous. With the exception of some environmental storytelling and a few side quests, the game doesn't seem willing to commit to a more nuanced or complete exploration of its setting and themes, and the kitchen sink controversy main plot is rarely engaging enough on its own, acting more as a through line to propel Jensen through the story. I know that these games are first and foremost intended to be action games, but that doesn't excuse sloppy writing. In an interview in August 1986 at his home in Vancouver, William Gibson had this to say when asked about what impact other media has had on his sensibilities. Escape from New York never made it big, but it's been redone a billion times as a rock video. I saw that movie, by the way, when I was starting Burning Chrome, and it had a real influence on Neuromancer. I was intrigued by the exchange in one of the opening scenes where the warden says to Snake, "You flew the Wing 5 over Leningrad, didn't you?" It turns out to just be a throwaway line, but for a moment, it worked like the best science fiction, where casual reference can imply a lot. A story doesn't need to be understood in its entirety in order for it to be appreciated. Humanity is weird in that often the stories we consider the best are those that are content to leave things ambiguous, satisfied in the knowledge that they have left behind a yearning for more, a need to ask questions and put a part of yourself as the viewer back into those stories. What to take away from this is, you don't need to fill the audience in on every detail of what's happening, just enough for them to make interesting leaps within their understanding of the story. One of the most important things in a cyberpunk story is in how the protagonist relates to the world. This aspect of the genre, along with many others, is highly inspired by the depictions of the hero in the neo-noir tradition, where the protagonist's relation to the law and morality are kept ambiguous. These are not the paragons of virtue you see in other genres. William Gibson's characters are often quintessential representations of the archetype: hackers and mercenaries, artists and street samurai, people both in control of and enthralled to the technology that plays such an integral part in this world. As explained by Michael in Lessons from the Screenplay, this is what makes the protagonist capable of navigating a world filled with this type of ambiguity. Cyberpunk, let's not forget, is a subgenre of punk, and as such its heroes are typically distrusting of authority and all its implications, typically living lives on the fringe, away from the clamor of a hyper-industrialized world. Another common trait of cyberpunk protagonists is for them to endure suffering, either through pain or through loss of freedom. Neuromancer's protagonist, the burnt-out hacker Case, has his ability to jack into cyberspace restored by his new employers, but is then pressed into compliance at the threat of a mycotoxin embedded in his bloodstream. This is another place I think Deus Ex stumbled, by making Adam Jensen immune to the need for neuropathy. As a story detail, gameplay mechanic, and honestly just thematic consistency, I think it makes a lot of sense for Jensen to have a reliance on neuropathy, but clearly the folks at IDOS disagree. As any system evolves and gains complexity, each part of the whole becomes more capable of carrying out its functions on its own. As we evolved, so too did the expectation that we become more self-sufficient. As we make more tools to maximize the potential of the individual, we strip away reasons to do things that extend beyond carrying out our individual purpose. And as Matt Draper's excellent analysis of Blade Runner dives into, the city, with its vast and monolithic structures that dwarf the individual, is a metaphor for all of the complexity that the future holds. The needs of the system in the dystopic future of Blade Runner are so demanding that they eclipse any single person. The future is a lonely place. And despite all the technology has done to improve the condition of the individual, it is also responsible for the tectonic shift in societal structure that has led us to the more isolated world that we occupy today. Blade Runner resonates with people on a deeper level than a lot of fiction, because it's not just about escapism. It holds up a mirror to the ugly truth of reality, and to quote Theodor Adorno's description, is not a work which resolves objective contradictions in a spurious harmony, but one which expresses the idea of harmony negatively, embodying the contradictions, pure and uncompromised, in its innermost structure. Many of the themes of cyberpunk are a projection of modern-day fears and anxieties carried forward into the future. This isn't to say that your entire world should be constructed through extrapolation. There's a wonderful article by Ursula Le Guin on why that's a terrible idea, but rather a reminder that science fiction isn't really about the future. If anything, science fiction is about today, viewed from a different perspective. It's impossible to avoid the role that systems of power, commerce, and politics play within a story when discussing cyberpunk, and cyberpunk often chooses to base its worldview in a critique of hyper-industrialization, deregulated capitalism, and established authority figures. In Transmetropolitan, the protagonist Spider Jerusalem is a gonzo journalist speaking truth to the power of the city's various structures of oppression, be they corrupt politicians, police brutality, or invasive advertising, while also taking the time for some more surreal high-concept explorations of futuristic technology and its implications. In particular, Spider is shown to be empathetic to the freaks, the fringe, and the outsiders. Being a loner and something of an anarchist, the story often centers itself around his struggle to capture the truth of these injustices and communicate them to the world at large, railing against the silent complacence of those who look on mutely. Obviously, there are benefits in having a story that takes some inspiration from contemporary events, but does that mean your story needs to be... If you're watching this video, then you've probably already watched MrBTongue's video on Cyberpunk, and he makes a point that I disagree with. He says that one of the things that defines Cyberpunk is its grounding in realism. And while I can see the point that he's trying to make, I think this definition could limit the potential of stories that can be told within the genre. For instance, William Gibson is on record saying that at the time of writing Neuromancer, he didn't even own a computer, and only had a vague understanding of how they worked. Unlike what you might suspect, this didn't hinder his ability to create an interesting narrative, but rather allowed him to romanticize the idea of a computer into a metaphor for human memory. There's also franchises like Shadowrun that explicitly drop any pretense at being grounded in realism, and launch full steam into having a world filled with dwarves, elves, trolls, magic, and who knows what else. Seriously though, what else? Let me know more about Shadowrun in the comments if you've played any of the games, cause I haven't and they look interesting. You could argue that Shadowrun strays closer to science fantasy with this, and you wouldn't be wrong, but my point is that a dogmatic adherence to realism doesn't really serve anyone, and can potentially hold you back from exploring some really interesting ideas. A problem that I have with a lot of cyberpunk-inspired media is that they derive their visual aesthetic from exactly one place, namely Blade Runner. It's not hard to see why. The world created by Ridley Scott is evocative, intriguing, majestic, and menacing all at once, and in some ways could be considered the pure distillation of the cyberpunk aesthetic. However, I think it's possible to build upon the world that Blade Runner gave us. Homages to a classic are great, but I think that a lot of the recycling of visual concepts happens because it's a lot easier to point at an existing well-established work and say, well, let's just make something like that. I'm not trying to knock this approach, but I think that there's a better way, which is to examine the choices made by these genre-defining works and try to understand what influenced them in the direction it did. To wit, the three main influences on the visual aesthetic of cyberpunk in general are a tradition of art that eventually made its way into film noir. This style involves the use of explicitly surreal and sometimes bizarre choices in color palette, lighting, themes, and camera angles in order to convey the emotions of the story and characters. In Blade Runner, this is seen through a prodigious use of light shafts, dust, smoke, fog, and moving light, in order to lend atmosphere to the sets. Something integral to the punk part of cyberpunk, I think, is a rejection of the notion that the city of tomorrow will solve all the problems of today. A type of cynical pragmatism with which to regard the future and say, it'll probably just be a lot like the present, but weirder. Accordingly, a common trope of cyberpunk is the emergence of chaos and complexity within systems, fueled by the creation of technology that either cannot keep up with or utterly outpaces the needs of its creators. Yes, the entire country, all of it. Its culture, its ideals, its aesthetic, all of it is reflected in cyberpunk to an incredible degree. To quote William Gibson, modern Japan simply was cyberpunk. What to take away from this is that the reliance on the existing visual metaphors of cyberpunk does you no favors as a creator. In other words, cyberpunk is not equal to an aesthetic or visual movement, and there's a great series of blog posts by Shaun Duke on why that's the case. When I was talking about cyberpunk on Twitter, I was asked if I had read the Nexus series by Ramez Nam, a cyberpunk trilogy of books released recently, and it struck me that newer cyberpunk might have some interesting differences from older works like Neuromancer to be observed. I decided to read at least one book from the series before I finished the episode in order to inform my view, but it was a bit of a chore, as while the author clearly knows his cyberpunk, his writing style can be clumsy at times, with him unabashedly using cliches that should have never made it past an editor. There is no acceptable reason for a story to use the line, "She'd stared into the abyss and it had transformed her," unironically. I know I sound like I'm completely tearing this down, but truth be told, it's not all that bad. Taken on its own, it's still a decent work of cyberpunk that's clearly filled with love for the classics that have inspired it, with homages to Blade Runner and other cultural landmarks of the genre. Something that can't be missed though, when observing newer works of cyberpunk, like Nexus and Mankind Divided, is that the perspective of technology has shifted considerably. Though some of this also comes down to the author and their knowledge of technology, something you see reflected in older cyberpunk is this almost mystical nature in which technology is perceived, similar to how Gibson's ignorance of how a computer worked enabled him to riff on it in such a creative way. This was born out of this outlook on technology that might not be present to the same extent anymore, given the degree to which technology has permeated everyday life and our familiarity with it. That'll be it for this video. I hope it's provided some food for thought about what makes cyberpunk tick, but keep in mind that's just my perception of it. You might have a different idea of it, and if that's the case, let me know. This video was something of a diversion from usually scheduled programming, but I've been in a huge cyberpunk kick ever since the new Blade Runner came out, and I figured it was as good a time as any. Not sure what my next video is going to be about, but I'm currently playing Hob, and it's really interesting and it's got me thinking about level design, so expect something along those lines. Thanks for watching.